October 22nd, 1968. A private apartment in the Pierre Hotel, New York City. Richard Nixon sat by the telephone staring at a yellow legal pad. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the suffocating tension of a campaign that was suddenly, violently, sliding off the rails. Outside, the autumn wind whipped down Fifth Avenue. Inside, the future 37th President of the United States was sweating. The presidential election was exactly 2 weeks away. For months, Nixon had held a commanding lead over Vice President Hubert Humphrey. The country was on fire. Cities were burning. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were dead, and the American public was exhausted by the chaos. Nixon was the candidate of law and order. He was the inevitable correction to a decade of madness. But in late October, the one thing Nixon feared more than anything else had materialized. It was the October surprise. Intelligence reports from inside the White House, leaked by a mole, confirmed that President Lyndon Johnson was on the verge of a breakthrough in Paris. The peace talks to end the Vietnam War were succeeding. Johnson was preparing to announce a total bombing halt of North Vietnam. Hanoi had agreed to sit down with the South Vietnamese government. If peace broke out, or even if the promise of peace felt real, the mood of the country would shift instantly. Humphrey, the happy warrior, would look like a peacemaker. Nixon would look like a relic of the Cold War. The polls were already tightening. Nixon's lead had evaporated from 15 points to 5. He could feel the presidency slipping through his fingers just as it had in 1960 against Kennedy. He looked at his campaign manager, John Mitchell. They didn't need a new slogan. They didn't need a new ad. They needed to stop the peace. Nixon picked up the phone. He wasn't calling a voter. He wasn't calling a donor. He was calling a mysterious, glamorous woman named Anna Chennault, known in Washington social circles as the Dragon Lady. She was the widow of the famous Flying Tiger General Claire Chennault, and she was Nixon's secret back channel to the South Vietnamese government. The message Nixon wanted her to deliver to Saigon was simple, treasonous, and devastating. Hold on, we are going to win. Don't go to Paris. What Nixon didn't know was that the National Security Agency had bugged the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington. He didn't know that the FBI had tapped Anna Chennault's phone, and he certainly didn't know that inside the Oval Office, a heartbroken and furious Lyndon Johnson was reading transcripts of the sabotage, trembling with rage, calling it by its true name, treason. Nixon thought he was making a clever political maneuver to save a campaign. In reality, he was signing the death warrants of another 21,000 American soldiers. To understand why a man who had served as vice president would risk federal prison and the destruction of his country's foreign policy just to win an election, you have to understand the specific desperation of 1968. It wasn't just an election year, it was a national nervous breakdown. The Tet Offensive in January had shattered the illusion that the war was winnable. The nightly news was a reel of body bags and burning jungles. The Democratic Convention in Chicago had turned into a police riot, broadcast live to millions of horrified families. Nixon had built his entire campaign on a secret plan to end the war with honor, but he was trapped by a paradox. If the Democrats ended the war before the election, Nixon had no platform. His political survival depended on the war continuing, at least until January 20th, 1969. His flaw was his paranoia. He believed the Democrats were manipulating the peace talks purely to defeat him. He projected his own cynicism onto his opponents. He couldn't conceive that Lyndon Johnson, a man whose legacy had been destroyed by Vietnam, might actually want peace for the sake of peace. Nixon saw the bombing halt not as a diplomatic breakthrough, but as a cynical political trick. So, he decided to counter a trick with a crime. The instrument of this betrayal was Anna Chennault. She was the perfect conduit. She was wealthy, fiercely anti-communist, and deeply connected to President Nguyen Van Thieu in South Vietnam. Nixon couldn't talk to Saigon directly. That would be a flagrant violation of the Logan Act, a federal crime prohibiting private citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. But Chennault could talk to them as a friend. The deep dive into the archives, specifically the X-envelope files declassified decades later, reveals the mechanics of the conspiracy. It wasn't just a nod and a wink. It was an operational sabotage. Nixon used H.R. Haldeman, his future chief of staff, to relay specific instructions. The transcripts show Haldeman noting the order, "Keep Anna Chennault working on SVN, South Vietnam." The message she passed to Ambassador Bui Diem and directly to President Thieu in Saigon was explicit. She told them that the Democrats were desperate. She told them that if they went to Paris now, they would be sold out to the communists. She promised that if they waited for Nixon, they would get a better deal. She told them that Nixon was a hardliner who would support them, while Humphrey would abandon them. For President Thieu, this was exactly what he wanted to hear. He terrified of the peace talks. He feared the Americans were going to leave him to face the North Vietnamese alone. Nixon offered him a lifeline. All he had to do was stall. All he had to do was say no. The trap was sprung on November 2nd, 1968, 3 days before the American election. Lyndon Johnson went on television to announce the bombing halt. He spoke with the gravity of a man trying to heal a wound he had helped inflict. He expected the South Vietnamese government to issue a statement of support, signaling the start of serious negotiations. Instead, President Thieu issued a statement that shocked the world. He announced that South Vietnam would not participate in the Paris talks. He claimed the terms were a trap. He humiliated Johnson on the global stage. The table in Paris was set. The North Vietnamese were there. The Americans were there. But the chair for the South Vietnamese government remained empty. The peace initiative collapsed instantly. The October surprise turned into a November disaster for the Democrats. Hubert Humphrey, who had been surging in the polls on the hope of peace, was cut off at the knees. The narrative shifted. It looked like Johnson was incompetent, that he couldn't even deliver his own allies. But inside the White House, the mood wasn't confusion. It was cold fury. Lyndon Johnson had the tapes. The NSA had intercepted the cables from the South Vietnamese embassy to Saigon. The FBI had recorded Chennault's calls. Johnson knew exactly why Thieu had backed out. He knew Nixon's fingerprints were all over the refusal. Johnson called Senator Everett Dirksen, the Republican Senate Minority Leader, a man he respected. He didn't mince words. "We have been checking on this," Johnson roared into the phone. "And they're doing this. This is treason." "I know," Dirksen replied quietly. Johnson faced the most difficult dilemma of his presidency. He held the smoking gun that could destroy Richard Nixon. If he released the transcripts, Nixon would be branded a traitor. The election would turn into a landslide for Humphrey. Nixon might even face prison time. But to release the proof, Johnson would have to reveal that the NSA and FBI were spying on an American citizen and an ally's embassy. He would have to admit that the intelligence community was monitoring the opposition party's campaign. In the fragile atmosphere of 1968, Johnson feared that such a revelation would cause a constitutional crisis. He feared it would tear the country apart even further, making the riots in Chicago look like a garden party. He also didn't want to compromise the source, the NSA's ability to crack South Vietnamese codes. So Johnson made a call to Nixon directly. It was a game of high-stakes poker played over the telephone. Johnson asked Nixon point-blank if he was involved in sabotage. Nixon, with the cool detachment of a sociopath, lied. "My God, I would never do anything to encourage South Vietnam not to come to that conference table," Nixon said. "I would never do that, Lyndon." Johnson hung up the phone. He turned to his aides and said, "He's lying." But Johnson, a man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had buried half of them himself, decided to stay silent. He locked the file, the X envelope, in his safe. He took the secret to his grave to protect the office of the presidency, believing that the stability of the transfer of power was more important than the crime of the man taking power. On election night, the sabotage paid off. Nixon won by a razor-thin margin, less than 1% of the popular vote. If the peace talks had started, if Thieu had said yes, Humphrey almost certainly would have won. Nixon entered the White House. The war was his now, and this is where the tragedy compounds into horror. The better deal Nixon had promised Thieu never materialized. That was the lie that extended the war. Once in office, Nixon realized the hard reality of geopolitics. The North Vietnamese weren't going to surrender just because a Republican was in the White House. They weren't going to offer better terms. Nixon realized that the deal Johnson had negotiated in 1968 was actually the best deal available. But Nixon couldn't accept Johnson's terms immediately. He had to look tough. He had to validate the delay. So the war dragged on. It didn't just continue, it expanded. Nixon ordered the secret bombing of Cambodia. He authorized the invasion of Laos. He mined Haiphong Harbor. He tried to bomb the North into submission, using the madman theory to make them think he was crazy enough to use nuclear weapons. For 4 years, the meat grinder continued. The peace talks in Paris became a farce, arguing over the shape of the table while men died in the Achau Valley. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The terms were shocking. They were almost identical to the terms offered in October 1968. The United States would withdraw. North Vietnamese troops would remain in the South. The government of South Vietnam would eventually fall. The difference between 1968 and 1973 wasn't the treaty. The difference was the graveyard. Between Nixon's inauguration and the signing of the peace accords, another 202 American soldiers were killed. Their names are carved into the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, from panel 33W to panel 1W. Those names represent the cost of the phone call. Over 1 million more Vietnamese civilians and soldiers died in those 4 years. The country was ripped apart by the Kent State shootings, the release of the Pentagon Papers, and the disintegration of trust in government. And the irony was brutal. The Chennault affair didn't just extend the war. It poisoned the entire Nixon presidency. The paranoia that led Nixon to sabotage the peace talks in 1968 was the exact same paranoia that led him to Watergate in 1972. In fact, the two scandals are linked by a direct line of fear. When the Pentagon Papers were leaked in 1971, Nixon wasn't terrified about the military history of the war. He was terrified that the leak would expose the files on the bombing halt. He was terrified the X envelope would come out. He created the Plumbers, the unit that broke into the Watergate, specifically to find and destroy any documents that could prove his 1968 treason. He entered the presidency by breaking the law to win an election, and he destroyed his presidency because he broke the law to hide how he won the first one. Nixon died in 1994. He was eulogized as a brilliant statesman who opened China and achieved détente with the Soviet Union. But the tapes remained. The NSA files were eventually declassified. The verdict of history is no longer ambiguous. The lesson of the Nixon sabotage isn't just about one man's ambition. It's about the terrifying gap between campaigning and governing. In a campaign, the opponent is the other candidate. In governance, the opponent is reality. Nixon treated the Vietnam War as a campaign issue to be managed, a variable to be manipulated for votes. He didn't treat it as a human tragedy involving the lives of his own citizens. He stopped the peace to win the job. But by extending the war, he destroyed the very authority he sought to possess. He gained the White House, but he lost the soul of the nation. When you walk past the Vietnam Wall today, the sheer length of it is overwhelming. It starts low, rises to a peak, and tapers off again. But if you stand at the center where the wall is highest and look at the names from 1969, 1970, 1971, and 1972, you are looking at the victims of a delay. You are looking at men who died not for strategic necessity, not for the defense of freedom, and not even for a mistake. They died for a plurality in the Electoral College. They died because a man in a smoky room in New York made a phone call and decided that his ambition was worth more than their lives. And that is a cost no victory and no presidency can ever justify.